Hey booktube! If you're new here, my name is the Book Mage, and if you're not new, then welcome back. So this video is going to be my January wrap up, so all of the books I read in January, and shocking, I did actually read something in January. I'm still not reading as much as I used to, but I did read 3 books, which is better than nothing. So the first book I read I actually started and in fact mostly read in December, and that book is The Puppy Walk by R F Kuang. So this is an Asian-inspired adult high fantasy, and it follows a girl called Rin. She takes this very grueling test and is admitted to like this super prestigious warriors academy. It has a lot of elements of like real-world China and real-world Japan, but for the most part it's mostly about like the horrors of war against this like very fantastical theological backdrop. So I don't really want to say much more than that because I think like some of the things that are going to be like the major key plot points of the series tend not to like really pop up until like much further into the book, and for like at least the first 100 pages it's just stuff to do with the academy, so I'm not really going to go any further into like spoiler territory because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. So I've known a lot of people on BookTube who have absolutely raved about this book, and a lot of the people that I've seen that have read it have said it is obviously very, very dark. There are a lot of like really sensitive topics, and there should be a lot of trigger warnings given. I think I'm very privileged in that I am not bothered or triggered by anything in this book. I think because I'd heard so many people talk about it, I was expecting so much worse. It is bad, obviously. It's about war and like the horrible things that human beings will do to one another, and this book is actually really, really good for grey morality. There's a lot of like, you want to root for certain characters, but also you can't really justify a lot of the actions that people take, and that's all I'm gonna say. But I do admit, when I first started reading this, for like at least the first 100 pages, I really wasn't sure whether this was a YA. I'm pretty sure it's meant to be adult because of the content, but just like the style and the characters and the tropes made me feel it was very YA. So it was a bit of there was like a period of adjustment there while I was reading it, because I was like, okay, this is where we're going, okay. Having said that, I did really like this book, but I didn't love this book. I found there was like a section, like I kind of flew through a bit of the beginning and I managed to read a lot of the end very quickly. Like once the action picked up, it was much more interesting, but there was a whole like middle chunk of the book where I thought it was so slow and such a slog. And again, I don't necessarily want to say that that'll be the same for everyone, because as I've said, this is the first book I've like managed to read in a long time, and my mental health is not the best right now, and sitting and reading a book is not always the easiest thing for me right now, which is different to how I normally am on this channel. But I do want to make that clear that like that might just be my experience and might not reflect your experience if you pick up this book. But for me, since I rate everything on personal enjoyment, I did end up rating this a 3 stars. I think if I'm doing like halves and things, it might be like more like a 3.5, I'm not sure. But for whole stars, I just went with like a 3-star rating for this. It was good, and I am going to continue on with the series. Like partway through this book, I did go ahead and order the 3rd book in the series because I knew that I was going to carry on with it, and so it's a series that I definitely do want to continue with, and I think there's a lot of like merit to it because it's very interesting. I wasn't totally sold on it, but like the ending, again no spoilers, the way that it ended, I think the author made some decisions that a lot of authors would not have made, and that really intrigues me, and I really want to see where this series goes and what happens to these characters. Saying that in typical me fashion, all the characters that I like the most are the ones with like the least page time, so I'm hoping they'll come back in book 2, but we'll see. Okay, so the next book that I read in January was The Betrayals by Bridget. And again, I say this every time, the cover of this book is stunning, and I'm actually twinning with the pages somehow. There's a running thing on my channel where I seem to always accidentally have the hair colour of books that I'm talking about. So yeah, this was one of my most anticipated releases of like last year, and it's one of my most anticipated reads of this year, and I think I put this on my like 5-star prediction video. So I may have been wrong. I do want to say this book is not bad by any means, and just to get it out of the way, I again gave this a 3 stars. I had really hoped it would be a 5-star, but it just was not. So the story of this is very hard to tell because I'm not sure what you would consider spoilers and what you would not. And that is also to say that there are not a lot of events within this book. It is very character driven, but I also feel like a big downfall of this book is that it's not that the characters are dislikable, because you are kind of meant to sort of like sit on the fence of do I like this character, do I not like this character, and it's not that characters are necessarily morally grey, it's more just that they are very human. They are very realistic depictions of people, and not always the nicest people, but I think that that does make them interesting to read about. However, I suppose if the story itself, if there is no true like beginning, middle and end, like there's no finale to this book essentially, if everything rests solely on the characters, I feel like there wasn't enough of an arc. They didn't change enough, they didn't experience enough, I didn't get enough out of those characters. So it is a weird book. It feels like it's not quite literary fiction, but it has that edge to it. So I'm rambling. So basically what this book is about, and this is going to be very hard, is in this world there is a fictional game called The Grand Jeu, and it's loosely based on the glass bead game. It's kind of like this unknowable, like you can't actually play this game in real life because the author hasn't actually made real rules to it. It doesn't exist, but it's to do with like maths and music and art and language, and it's meant to be like this big all-encompassing thing. And there is an academy where very rich boys or like very privileged boys go to study the Grand Jeu, and this is all kind of set against this backdrop of this really like dystopian political landscape. So this book technically has like 4 main POVs, 3 of them are like major ones, and then 2 are like set in the present. One of them is like a flashback, one of which is a politician who did work for this party who has been disgraced and like sent back to this academy where he studied as a youth to like keep him out of the way. So the story does like flick back and forth between the 2 main characters in the present day, this like flashback narrative that's told through like a diary, and then this other sort of occasional random other POV. And if you ask me what the story is, it's just kind of, for the most part, it's unravelling what happened in the past. I guess just how that plays into the present situation. And again, it's kind of really hard to describe. My favourite perspective was the diary. I did really like seeing the academy from like the perspective of a student, and I thought it was much more dynamic and interesting and engaging than like the other like present setting like POVs. So the things I like about this book, Bridget Collins really does write in this very lovely sort of way. That is very nice, and the book does have a really nice atmosphere. It is very atmospheric, and I did enjoy that. However, as I said before, part of my issue with this book was I was just expecting more. A lot of the issues like faced between characters in this book are off of like the miscommunication trope, and there's just, it's sort of played over and over and over again to the point where I just need there to be some other driving force behind the conflict that isn't just constant miscommunication. And I don't know if that's done on purpose, because it is sort of like thematic with this whole, they're playing the Grand Jeu, which is, it's hard to explain. With the Grand Jeu, everything is kind of like, in this game they play, everything is sort of like laid bare to do with their theme, and yet they always have in the real like conversation, it's constant miscommunication and nobody seems to understand each other and everybody misreads each other, and I don't know if that's purposeful, but whether it is or whether it isn't, it did get kind of tiring. And I just, it's not to say that I didn't like the conflict and where it came from. You can see it coming way ahead of the characters revealing things. Like I feel like there's a very good breadcrumb trail there to say like, you know exactly what's going on. And again, I think it is the product of like this kind of story. It's planned to be a certain style, but I feel like something that I didn't really enjoy was the fact that there is no like a finale to this book. And again, I don't really want to go into spoilers, but there's a lot of especially like the background of like the setting, the world, to do with both the academy and like the political stuff going on in the background. I think there's too much attention given to that, because while I did want to know more about it, because they're both too much and not enough, I feel like if you're never going to address any of it and you're never going to, like, it doesn't really play into the story for the most part. It kind of does and it kind of doesn't. What I'm saying is there's no resolution to a lot of the issues that are brought up as like background information about the world, and it's kind of like there doesn't necessarily need to be, but I feel like if you're not going to give any sort of like satisfying conclusion to any of it, bring it up less, make it more vague, make it like more like esoteric, and just make it take up less time on the page. Like, you can say that there's like this weird like political dictatorship going on in the background, and like this persecution happening like off the page, and like the history of this academy off the page, and as a reader that will be very interesting. But if you just give me like a few little drips here and there so that I understand but I don't need to know any more information, if you then don't expand upon that and don't conclude that, that's fine, because I don't expect it. But I feel like the author put too much in there, to the point where I was thinking, well, now I do want a conclusion and an explanation. And I feel like the way that the book ended was just very unsatisfying, and I feel like a lot of books of this kind of type might end in a similar way, in that there is no sort of like big massive like finale or like well wrapped up like conclusion. But I feel like it was just sort of like, oh, it ended. Like, I was reading and it was just like, oh, that's it, that's the last page, okay. So I liked it, but it was definitely disappointing. And again, I thought the atmosphere was probably the best thing about this book, because like I was thinking about this book when I wasn't reading it, but I wasn't interested in like the characters or the plot. I was just thinking about like the environment and the world, and like the descriptions and like the locations that are described here, which are very nice to think about. But the characters and what happens to them specifically, I just didn't care that much about, which is kind of sad. I will still be picking up anything else that Bridget Collins writes, because I do like her writing style, and I think this one may have just been like a hit and a miss for me. So I'd recommend reading this one if it sounds like something you would specifically like. I feel like this book would be perfect if you're on like a very long journey or something, but I think if you're expecting something like beautiful and like meaningful or like emotionally impactful, this is not it. And the last book that I picked up in January was Strange Weather in Tokyo by Hiromi Kawakami. So this book, kind of a bit like the Betrayals, it's very, very character based. This one is like solely character based. There is no plot, there is no like constant narrative other than these characters and their interactions. And I think compared to the Betrayals, it's done much better here. So this follows I think she's middle-aged, a woman called Tsukiko, and she frequents this bar, and while she's there one night, she runs into like her old high school teacher, and they end up talking and they end up chatting, and they develop this relationship where they don't plan to meet, but they often run into each other, and they often end up drinking at the same bar. And whenever they do run into each other, they always make a point of sitting together, drinking together, like talking together, getting some food, that sort of thing. And so over the course of several years, you sort of follow Tsukiko and the way that her relationship with Sensei develops, and places they go, people they meet, like how they exist and change as people. And it's very, very human for a story, because it really does just purely focus on this woman's everyday life, her everyday interactions. She could be like literally anyone. There's nothing dramatic about this, there's nothing fantastical about this. This could like literally be somebody's diary of just a regular thing, and it's not over the top or dramatized in like pretty much any way. It's very, very realistic. And I have read a few other Japanese novels that are of like this same kind of vein, and I think it is more typical to not necessarily need that much like fanfare about a story when you compare it to like some Western tropes, where I think we're a bit more restricted in what we publish here. So it did feel really, really different reading this, and it was quite refreshing and quite nice to just sort of sit down with something where it just sort of like meanders about, and there isn't really like any sort of, there's nothing directly pressing that you need to know. It's just sort of nice to hear this story and find out what happens. And it is set in Tokyo, which is somewhere that I would very much like to go. I've had family that lived and worked in Tokyo, not right now because obviously state of the world and all, but as someone who studied Japanese and has family or had family over there, I've always wanted to go to Tokyo at least once in my life. I really like the way that Tokyo is portrayed in this, because it's very like down to earth. It's very like the people that live here, this is how they would view it, as opposed to like a tourist. It feels very snug for a book. That said, as I said before, I always rate everything on personal enjoyment, so while I did enjoy reading this, I don't necessarily think it's something that's going to stick with me. It is very short, and while it was enjoyable and I don't dislike the writing or anything like that, I feel like in order for me to really love a book, it does have to impact me in some way. I just didn't get that from this book. While I do like books like this, and while I will read more books in this style and possibly by this author, I kind of can't really rate it anything higher than a 3 stars, because that's just like the genuine amount of enjoyment and entertainment that I got from this book. So I mean, it is on the same level as these two, But yeah, there's nothing in here that would, for me personally, really push it up to like a 4-star book. But it was a nice, cozy, stress-free reading experience. So yeah, those were the 3 books that I read in January. I know this is not as big or like as fantastical as some of my previous wrap-ups. There's the fact that there's only 1 fantasy book on here, while it does feel like it's been like a very kind of mediocre reading month, because these are all just like 3 stars. There's nothing that I'm like particularly here to like rave or rant about. I feel like I'm just pleased with myself for being able to get back into reading like just a little bit, considering just how like out of reading that I've been. So this has been a good start to the year. I don't know if it'll continue, but there's no way I can be displeased with this because I at least read 3 books. It's not a lot for some people, but for me right now, I need to be pleased with this. And I am. So that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this like little wrap up. I feel like it was very diverse in terms of what I've read. Let me know if you've read any of these or like if you're intending to pick any of them up. Otherwise that's been it from me, and hopefully I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!